Episode 72, May-June 1915. Gallipoli, Sniper's Paradise and Soldier's Hell by A.P. Herbert. Read by Michael Lucas. After his service with the Hawke Battalion of the R.N.D. in Gallipoli, Mr. A.P. Herbert, famous playwright, poet, essayist and novelist, fought on the Western Front, where he was wounded. The last weeks of May had something of the quality of an old English summer, and the 7 plagues of the peninsula had not yet attained the intolerable violence of June and July. True, the inhabited portion of the narrow land we won had already become in great part a wilderness. The myrtle and rock rose and tangled cistus and all that wealth of spring flowers in which the landing parties had fallen and died in April had long been trodden to death, and there were wide stretches of yellow desert where not even the parched scrub survived. But in the 2.5 miles of bare country which lay between the capes and the foothills of Achibaba was one considerable oasis of olives and stunted oaks, and therein, on the slopes of the bridge, was our camp fortunately set. The word camp contains an unmerited compliment to the place. The manner of its birth was characteristic of military arrangements in those days. When we were told, on that first mysterious midnight, to dig ourselves a shelter against the morning's searching, we were far from imagining that what we dug would be our peninsular home and haven of rest from the firing line for many months to come. And so we made what we conceived to be the quickest and simplest form of shelter against a quite temporary emergency. Long, straight, untraversed ditches running parallel to and with but a few yards between each other. No worse form of permanent dwelling place could conceivably have been constructed, for the men were cramped in these places with a minimum of comfort and a maximum of danger. No man could climb out of his narrow drain without casting a shower of dust from the crumbling parapet onto his sleeping neighbour in the next ditch, and 3 large German shells could have destroyed half the regiment. Yet there were many such camps, most of them lacking the grateful concealment of our trees. Such targets even the Turkish artillery must sometimes hit. There were no dugouts in the accepted sense of the Western Front, no deep, elaborate staircase chambers hollowed out by miners with miners' materials. Our dugouts were dugouts, in truth, shallow excavations scooped in the surface of the earth. The only roof for a man against sun and shells was a waterproof sheet, stretched precariously over his hole. It is sufficient testimony to the indifference of the Turkish shelling that with such naked concentrations of men scattered about the peninsula, casualties and rest camps were so few. Each officer had his own private hole, set democratically among the men's, and an officer's mess was simply made by digging a larger hole and roofing it with 2 waterproof sheets instead of 1. There was no luxury among the infantry there, and the gulf which yawns between the lives of officer and man in France as regards material comfort was barely discernible in Gallipoli. Food was dull and monotonous. For weeks we had only bully beef and biscuit and a little coarse bacon and tea, but it was the same for all, one honourable equality of discomfort. At first there were no canteen facilities, and when some newcomer came from one of the islands with a bottle of champagne and another of chartreuse, we drank it with bully and cast-iron biscuit. Drinking water was as precious as the elixir of life, and almost as unobtainable, but officer and man had the same ration to eke out through the thirsty day. Wells were sunk, and sometimes immediately condemned, and when we knew the water was clear and sweet to taste, it was hard to have it corrupted with the metallic flavour of chemicals by the medical staff. Then indeed did a man learn to love water. Then did he learn discipline, when he filled his water bottle in the morning with the exiguous ration of the day, and fought with the intolerable craving to put it to his lips, and there and then gurgle down his fill. In the spring nights it was very cold, and men shivered in their single blanket under the unimaginable stars, But very early the sun came up, and by 5 o'clock all the camp was singing, and there were 3 hours of fresh coolness when it was very good to wash in a canvas bucket and smoke in the sun before the torrid time came on. And again at 7, when the sun sat perched on the great rock of Samothrace, and Imbros was set in a fleecy marvel of pink and saffron clouds, there were 2 hours of pure physical content. But these, I think, were more nearly perfect than the morning, because they succeeded the irritable fevers of the day. Then the crickets in the branches sang less tediously, and the flies melted away, and all over the peninsula the wood fires began to twinkle in the dusk, as the men cooked over a few sticks the little delicacies which were preserved for this hour of respite. When we had done, we sat under our olive tree in the clear twilight and watched the last aeroplanes sail home to Rabbit Islands, and talked and argued till the glowworms, glimmering in the scrub, and up the hill the long roll of the Turks' rapid fire told us that darkness was at hand, and the chilled dew sent us into our crannies to sleep. In France, apart from full-dress attacks, an infantryman may live for many months without once firing his rifle, or running the remotest risk of death by a rifle bullet. Patiently he tramps and watches and digs, and is shelled, clinging fondly to his rifle night and day, but seldom or never in a position to use it. So that in the stagnant days of the past he came to look upon it as a mere part of his equipment, like his water bottle, only heavier and less comforting, and in real emergencies fumbles stupidly with the unfamiliar mechanism. This was true for a long time of the normal or peacetime sectors of France. But in the hill trenches of Gallipoli, the Turk and the Gentile fought with each other all day with rifle and bomb, and in the evening crept out and stabbed each other in the dark. There was no release from the strain of watching and listening and taking thought. The Turk was always on higher ground. He knew every inch of all those valleys and vineyards and scrub-strewn slopes, and he had an uncanny accuracy of aim. Moreover, many of his men had the devotion of fanatics, which inspired them to lie out behind our lines, with stores of food enough to last out their ammunition, certain only of their own ultimate destruction, but content to lie there and pick off the infidels till they too died. They were very brave men. But the Turkish snipers were not confined to the madmen who were caught disguised as trees in the broad daylight and found their way into the picture papers. Every trench was full of snipers, less theatrical but no less effective. And in the night they crept out with unbelievable stealth and lay close into our lines, killing our sentries and chipping away our crumbling parapets. So the sniping was terrible. In that first week, we lost 12 men each day. They fell without a sound in the early morning, as they stood up from their cooking at the brazier, fell shot through the head, and lay snoring horribly in the dust. They were sniped as they came up the communication trench with water, or carelessly raised their heads to look back at the ships in the bay. And in the night there were sudden screams, where a sentry had moved his head too often against the moon. If a periscope were raised, however furtively, it was shivered in an instant. If a man peered over himself, he was dead. Far back in the reserve lines, or at the wells, where a man thought himself hidden from view, the sniper saw and killed him. All along the line were danger posts, where many had been hit. These places became invested with a peculiar awe, and as you came to them, the men said, "Keep low here, sir," in a mysterious whisper, as though the Turk could hear them. Indeed, so uncanny were many of the deaths that some men said the Turk could see impossibly through the walls of the trench and crouched nervously in the bottom. All the long communication trenches were watched, and wherever a head or a moving rifle showed at a gap, a bullet came with automatic regularity. Going down a communication trench alone, a man would hear the tap of these bullets on the parapet following him along and break into a half-hysterical run in the bright sunlight to get away from this unnatural pursuit, for such it seemed to him to be. The fire seemed to come from all angles, and units bitterly accused their neighbours of killing their men, when it seemed impossible that any Turk could have fired the shot. For a little then, this sniping was thoroughly on the men's nerves. Nothing in their training had prepared them for it. They hated the blinded feeling it produced. It was demoralizing always to be wondering if one's head was low enough, always to walk with a stoop. It was tiring to be always taking care, and it was very dangerous to relax that care for a moment. Something had to be done, and the heavy, methodical way in which these Tynesiders of ours learned to counter and finally overcome the sniper is characteristic of the nation's effort throughout this war. The Turks were natural soldiers, fighting in their own country. More, they were natural scouts. Our men were ponderous, uncouth pitmen from Tyneside and the Clyde. But we chose out a small body of them who could shoot better than their fellows and called them snipers. And behold, they were snipers. We gave them telescopes and periscopes and observers and set them in odd corners and told them to snipe. And by slow degrees they became interested and active and expert and killed many Turks. The third time we came to those trenches, we could move about with comparative freedom. In all this, Harry took a leading part, for the battalion scout officer was one of the first casualties, and Harry, who had had some training as a scout in the ranks, was appointed in his place. In this capacity, he was in charge of the improvised snipers, and all day moved about the line from post to post, encouraging and correcting. All this he did with characteristic energy and enthusiasm, and tired himself out with long wanderings in the scorching sun. In those trenches, all movement was an intense labour. The sun blazed always into the suffocating ditch where no breath of air came. The men not on duty lay huddled wherever they could steal an inch of shade, with the flies crawling about their eyes and open mouths. Progress was a weary routine of squeezing past men or stepping over them or running into men round corners, as one stooped to escape death. In little niches in the wall were mess tins boiling over boxwood fires so that the eyes smarted from their smoke, and the air was full of the hot fumes, and everywhere was the stuffy smell of human flesh. In the heat of the day, these things produced in the healthiest man an intolerable irritation and fatigue. To a frail, sensitive youth like Harry, his day-long rambles must have been torture, but though he too became touchy, he pursued his task with determination and would not be tempted away. The rest of us, when not on watch, lay torpid all the hot hours in the shallow holes we had scratched behind the trench and called company headquarters. These places were roofed only with the inevitable waterproof sheet, and had there been any serious shelling, would have been death traps. Into these dwellings came many strange animals, driven from their nests among the roots of the scrub. Snakes, lizards, and hideous centipedes. Large, clumsy winged things, which some said were locusts, fell into the trench, and for a few hours strove vainly to leap out again till they were trampled to death. They had the colour of ivory and shone with bright tints in the sun, like shot silk. The men found tortoises derelict in near shell holes, and set them to walk in the trench, and they too wandered sadly about till they disappeared, no man knew where. The flies were not yet at full strength, but they were very bad, and all day we wrestled with thirst. He was a lucky man who could sleep in the daylight hours, and when the cool evening came beckoning him to sleep, he must rise and bestir himself for the work of the night. Then all the lines stirred with life again, with the cleaning of rifles thick with heavy dust, and the bustle of men making ready to stand to arms. Now, indeed, could a man have slept when all the pests of the day had been exorcised by the cool dusk, and the bitter cold of the midnight was not yet come. But there was no sleep for any man, only watching and digging and carrying and working and listening. And as soon as Achi Baba was swathed in shadow, and the sun well down behind the westward islands, the Turk began his evening fusillade of rapid fire.
Wipe the sleep, baby, tear from your eye. Though it's hard to hold Now toodle-oo, goodbye. Brother Bert, he went away to do his bit the other day. With a smile on his lips and his lieutenant lips upon his shoulder, bright and gay. As the train moved out, he said, remember me to all the birds, though he wagged his paw and went away to war, shouting out these pathetic